Good morning. Welcome to another session of the Indian economy. Today we will be discussing on Module 8, the services sector, under which we will study the growth of services sector, Unit 1. In this unit, we will try to understand the various definitions of service sector, what are the various subcomponents of the service sector, the role of service sector towards the Indian economy. We'll also try to analyze the trend of services sector right from the independence period, and we will also try to analyze the changing pattern of the services sector in India. According to Kuznets, Rostow, Chenery, and other traditional economic beliefs, there are different stages of development that a country goes through in its growth path. The structure of economy changes accordingly, and the traditional economists often argued that the first structural changes is from moving from an agricultural dominated economy to an industrialized economy, and then in the further developed stage to a service sector dominated economy. This path has been followed by many countries from developed to developing nations like UK, US, Japan and China in their path towards growth and development. In India also, the service sector has emerged as the most expensive and fastest growing sector in India. It has become the lifeline for a country's socio-economic growth as it contributes significantly to its GDP, employment, trade and investment. The service sector has played different roles in different types of economies. In most of the developed countries of the world, the service sector is contributing the major portion of its gross domestic product, and it generates 3 times more employment opportunities than the manufacturing sector. In most of the developing countries where agriculture and industry dominates the show in generating employment till a few years ago, but things have started to change in the recent period. In the recent years, service sector experienced a rapid shift in its favor in generating both income and employment in the developing countries. Thus, it has been observed that the service sector has become a major player in almost all the countries of the world. And for a country like India, which have a huge size of population, the service sector has its own potential. Development of the service sector can transform this burden of large size of manpower into an asset by its proper utilizations and can generate a huge size of income for the nation as a whole. Now let us look into the subcomponents of the service sector. The service sector is mainly consisted of the trade, transport, financial services, real estate and public administration. Let us look into the key components of the services sector in India. The most important one is the information technology and software services. In India, with firms like Wipro, Infosys and Tata Consultancy Services, India leads the world in IT services. This industry offers clients worldwide with business process, outsourcing, IT consulting, software development, and technical support services. The IT and software services industry has grown to be a significant source of employment and foreign exchange earnings. Next up, we have the financial services. This covers financial advising, asset management, banking, and insurance. In India, with large banks like State Bank of India, HDFC, ICICI and other international insurance companies operating here, India has a strong financial infrastructure. And India's financial technology industry is also expanding very quickly. And thanks to the emergence of the digital payment systems like Google Pay, Paytm and PhonePe. Next, we have the telecommunication industry. With millions of mobile phone users in India, The telecom industry is among the fastest growing in the world. Reliance Jio, Airtel, Vodafone Idea are major participants in the telecom industry. This industry has witnessed the introduction of 4G and 5G technologies and as well as other large infrastructure investments. Next, we have healthcare services. India is also known for its medical tourism sector, which attracts tourists seeking reasonably priced, top-notch medical care. Hospitals, diagnostic facilities, medical tourism, and medicines are part of India's expanding healthcare services industry. Through programs like Ayushman Bharat, the Indian government has also been putting more efforts into enhancing the healthcare system and making it more accessible. In education sector, the primary, intermediate and higher education are provided by a variety of public and private institutions throughout India's extensive education system. The post-COVID startups that provide online learning platforms such as Byju's, Unacademy and Vedantu are the driving forces in the edutech sector in India. Through programs like Skill India, the government is also concentrating on enhancing the skill development initiatives. In case of tourism and hospitality, India's rich history, diverse culture and beautiful landscapes make it a very popular travel destination both domestically and abroad. The travel agencies, lodging facilities, dining establishments and tourism-related activities are all included in the tourism sector. India's hospitality sector is also ever expanding and offering both high-end and low-cost lodging options. The government in this scenario is also encouraging programs like Incredible India to increase the tourism sector, which is a significant source of foreign exchange earnings for the nation. In case of retail and e-commerce, in India we have both the organized and unorganized retails industry. Modern retail models such as supermarkets, shopping centers and internet platforms have grown significantly over the period of time. With online shopping growing in popularity, the e-commerce sites such as Amazon, Flipkart, Myntra, Snapdeal have completely changed the retail industry in India. As in terms of logistics and supply chain, the growth of the e-commerce industry and the government's emphasis on infrastructure development has both contributed to the expansion of logistics and transportation services in India. With a rising focus on the last mile delivery of services, the industry includes transportation, warehousing and courier services. Lastly, we have the real estate and construction services. The residential, commercial and industrial buildings are all part of India's real estate market. The government has also initiated programs like Smart Cities and Housing for All to encourage the expansion of the real estate industry. Infrastructure projects like roads, bridges, ports and airports are also included in the construction sector. Now, having discussed the subcomponents of the services sector, let us now see how the services sector is contributing to the Indian economy. The major contribution of the services sector is the contribution towards the gross domestic product of the country. In India, the share of total services sector in India's GDP increased from 28.5% in 1950s to 31.8% in the 1970s, and then finally in 2020s, late 21-22, the share of the services sector has increased to 54%. The services sector has also contributed to the higher compound annual growth rate of the country. The importance of service sector to the Indian economy can be traced from its attainment of higher compound annual growth rate. The compound annual growth rate of the services sector attained almost around 10% for the period of 2004-5 to 2011-12 and has been found to be higher than the 8.6% of GDP during the same period, which clearly indicates that the services sector has outgrown both the industry and agricultural sector, showing its supremacy among all the three sectors of the economy in recent years. Next, the service sector also contributes to the trade. The service sector is playing a very important role in raising the volume of exports in the country. India is moving towards a service-led export growth in the recent years. During the period of 2004-5 to 2008-9, as per the balance of payments data, the merchandise and services exports grew by almost 22 to 25% respectively. The services sector has also helped in the FDI inflows in the country. The modest growth of services sector has made ample scope for the smooth inflow of FDI into the country. The FDI also plays a major role in the dynamic growth of the services sector. On the positive side, at global level, medium-term prospects of services are generally better than those manufacturing sector, with international investment in the services sector is expected to grow relatively faster. Contribution towards development of infrastructure and communication services. The services sector has also been playing a major role in developing and expanding infrastructure, with a special emphasis on development of transportation and communication services. In a developing country like India, the importance of development of infrastructural facilities is quite high. The contribution of transport, storage and communication to the GDP ranges from 8.2% in 2006-07 and has increased to 7.1% in 2011-12. The services sector has also been a major player in the employment generation of the economy. The importance of service sector can be realized from its contribution towards generation of employment in India. Although the primary sector, which is mainly comprised of the agricultural sector, is the dominant employer, but it is followed by the services sector, and the share of services sector has been increasing over the years over the primary sector and the secondary sector. Now let us look into the growth pattern of the services sector from the 1950s. At the period when the planning process started in the country, the contribution of the services sector was 29.5%. After a decade, in the 1960s, the same increased to 30%. In the 1970s, the same increased to 33%. In the 1980s, the contribution increased to 37% from 33%. And after the reforms of 1991, the contribution moved to 42.5%. After that, there was no looking back. The contribution of the services sector in 2000s almost led to 42.5%, and post that it has crossed 54.64%. The contribution of the sectors agriculture, industry and services sector from the period of 1970s till 2021. This figure 1, shows the share of the services sector, agriculture sector and industrial sector towards the GDP. During the time period of 1970 to 2019-20, it saw major structural change in the economy of India. In the 1970s, the agricultural sector had the major share in terms of output, with services sector and industry coming next. But in the 1980s, the service sector started expanding and the share increased to 37% in 1990s, and agricultural sector started declining and it fell down to 35%. Post reforms, after the implementation of the LPG, the structural economy saw another major change, and the service sector became dominant with a contribution of 54% in 2021, and the share of agriculture declined to 15%. The industrial sector, however, had a stagnant contribution of around 30% in that period. Now let's focus on the components of services sector and its share towards the GDP. In the figure 2, it is seen that the service sector has been through considerable change in the share of its components, which had remained almost the same till the early part of the 1990s. But post 1990s and in the early 2000s, the share of financial, real estate and professional services has increased considerably to 40%. Although this sector of service has always the dominant share, the reforms further strengthened the sector, and globalization and privatization contributed significantly to the growth of the financial services sector. Public administration, defense and other services also saw a decline in the share of the total service. Figure 3. It also shows the employment share of the sector-wise employment share. Post 90s, it was seen that agricultural sector had the major share of employment generation, followed by the industry and services sector. But post 2000, there has been a gradual decline in the agriculture employment generation in the agricultural sector, with a slight increase in the industrial sector and followed by the services sector. Now let us look into the services sector before and after the reforms. In India, the tertiary sector or the services sector was comparatively underdeveloped and heavily regulated prior to the 1991 economic reforms. It contributed less to the GDP than the primary and secondary sectors, and was primarily made up of government services like public administration, healthcare and education, and with almost little private participation in sectors like finance and telecommunications because of the stringent licensing and regulations. The service sector grew more slowly than it did in the post-reform era. Now look into this table where it shows the growth GDP and its sectoral growth rates. Prior to 1991, the growth rates in the agricultural sector, industry and services sector, and its contribution towards the GDP. During this entire period from 1980s to 1996, the average growth rate of the GDP was hovering around 5.7%, with primary sector contributing around 4%, the secondary sector contributing around 6.6% and the tertiary sector contributing around 6.5% on an average. But after the reforms, the tertiary sector picked up the pace and its contribution significantly increased with each passing year. Now let us look into the service sector prior to reforms. Prior to reforms of the 1991, the dominant public sector played a major role. The government-owned companies supplied the majority of services, which restricted competition and creativity. Due to rigid rules, the expansion of private service providers was impeded by onerous licensing requirements and administrative roadblocks. With limited foreign investment scope, the Indian service industry was largely inaccessible to foreign business, which led to the sluggish growth. And as a result of these limitations, the tertiary sector's growth was slower than it was during the post-reform era. But after the post-reforms of 1991, certain subsectors of the services industry picked up. For example, the telecommunication industry. Due to strict regulations and a state-owned monopoly, the telecom industry had limited access and antiquated technology prior to the reforms. But after the reforms, the telecommunication industry picked up after privatization. In case of financial services, the public sector banks dominated the banking and insurance industries, with little access to financial products and little involvement from the private sector. In terms of IT and BPO services, because of its limitations on the foreign investment and technological access, the IT sector was young and had little promise. But after the post-reforms of 1991, the telecommunications, financial services and IT and BPO services boomed. Let us look into the challenges for the services sector in India. The most profound one was the lack of government incentives. Many experts feel that government have not provided incentives to the services sector on the same lines as the manufacturing sector. For example, under the Export Promotion Scheme for Manufacturing, MEIS, merchandise export benefited to an extent of over rupees 40,000 crore in 2018-19. Whereas, on the other hand, the corresponding benefit for service exporters under the Service Exports Incentive Scheme was just rupees 4,000 crore. Similarly, the government provides incentives like tax exemptions for greenfield manufacturing projects. Such incentives are missing for creating infrastructure for services sector like tourism, building of hotels, hospitals and universities, etc. There is also a lack of PLI schemes for the service sector. Moreover, in the service sector is hampered by restrictions placed by foreign governments like restrictions on movements of service professionals, domestic certification requirement for foreign service trades, tax on offshore income of Indian service firms, etc. These restrictions limit the export potential of India's services sector. Similarly, India also performed poorly on OECD's Services Trade Restriction Index, where out of 50 countries, only Thailand and Indonesia were more restrictive than India. In case of skilled manpower, where there is a large pool of talented professionals, it is not enough to support the growth of the sector. The industrial experts often lament that many graduates lack employable skills and considerable effort is required to train them. In case of infrastructure, lack of infrastructure like transportation, connectivity, communication limit the potential of services sector like tourism and hospitality. Next is the issue of access to finance. Many small service firms lack access to affordable finance to scale up their operations. Lack of finance hampers access to technology, upskilling of people, upgradation of systems and processes that impacts their competitiveness. Now, how can the government address these issues? Firstly, the service sector in India requires structured policy interventions by the government. The government should launch a Services from India initiatives on the lines of the same campaign, Make in India. Government should also consider greater tax incentives and production-linked incentives scheme for the services sector to support an increase in the services exports. Secondly, the services needs to be accorded a greater priority in trade negotiation. India's focus on foreign trade agreements has been on merchandise trade. Although the trade is changing, the India-Australian Economic Cooperation Trade Agreement (ECTA) has several measures to facilitate India's service exports like mutual recognition of professional services, avoiding double taxation on offshore income of Indian services firms in Australia, etc. This should be ensured in India's upcoming foreign trade agreements. Thirdly, India should also push for setting standards for global data governance. Resolving data and privacy barriers will provide a big impetus to outsourcing of consultation services. India's services sector can be the biggest beneficiary in this regard. Fourthly, The IT sector contributes around 55% of total in the services sector. The government should make a comprehensive roadmap for further diversification of the services sector. The subsectors like healthcare, tourism, including medical tourism, banking and financial services, telecommunications, need to be supported for further expansion. Now let us look into certain future prospects of the services sector in India. By 2025, the healthcare industry is expected to reach around 372 billion US dollars. In terms of India's digital economy, it is estimated to reach around 1 trillion in US dollars. By the end of 2025, India's IT and business service sector is expected to reach around 14.3 billion US dollars with an increased growth rate of 8%. In case of artificial intelligence also, it is expected to boost India's annual growth rate by 1.3%. In terms of India's software service industry, it is expected to reach around 1 trillion US dollars by 2030. With this promising note, we conclude our today's discussion. For services sector growth to be high and sustainable, there is a necessary requirement of manufacturing sector to grow and the GDP per capita to continually increase. Most importantly, it is seen that there is a significant interlinkages and a strong positive relation within the various subcomponents of the service sector. Each component is linked and the growth and development are tied together. Hence, the government policy should focus on improving the general business environment and to remove trade restrictions and regulatory barriers not only for the service sectors but also for the other sectors as they are all intrinsically connected. Further, investment needs to be undertaken to improve our human capital as the economies are becoming more skill intensive.